There is a silence that follows dominance, and it is heavier than defeat. It arrives not when the final whistle blows on a losing season, but later. When the noise finally fades and no one is left to reassure themselves that everything is still under control. I have learned that this silence is where the truth waits, not on the field, not in the box score, but in the quiet moments when a dynasty realizes it can no longer outrun what it ignored. Dynasties create the illusion of permanence. They convince everyone involved that success is self-sustaining, that excellence reproduces itself automatically, and that yesterday's victories can always be used as collateral for tomorrow's risks. When a team wins long enough, doubt feels like disloyalty. Questions feel unnecessary. Warnings feel pessimistic. And eventually, silence becomes policy. I want to begin here because collapse does not announce itself with spectacle. It does not arrive wearing failure like a uniform. More often, it arrives disguised as confidence. The most dangerous collapses are the ones unfolding quietly while banners are still being hung. For years, this dynasty did everything it was supposed to do on the field. It won games. It dominated seasons. It became a measuring stick. Analysts praised its leadership. Fans trusted its vision. And because success is persuasive, that trust spread into places it did not belong. Into books that were no longer balanced. Into commitments that assumed a future that had not yet been earned. What people rarely talk about is how dynasties actually end. Cover for the belief that tomorrow's success will fix today's imbalance. I think often about what I call the season you do not realize is the last one, not the final championship. Not the year everything falls apart publicly, but the season when everything still looks intact. When players still speak about continuity. When executives still talk about stability. When fans still assume the future will resemble the past. That season is when collapse becomes inevitable, because it is the moment no one feels urgency. This dynasty had that season. In fact, it had several. Seasons where dominance masked fragility, where the product on the field insulated the business behind it, where revenue projections were treated as certainty instead of possibility, and where accountability was delayed because success made delay feel harmless. Money is not an emotional force, but its consequences are. It corrodes quietly. It works in spreadsheets and contracts and delayed payments. It does not care about history or legacy. It does not pause out of respect. And once it starts eroding the foundation of an organization, it does so patiently, waiting for gravity to do the rest. What makes this story unsettling is how familiar it is. We have seen untouchable dynasties before. Teams that looked invincible until suddenly they were not. In every case, the narrative focuses on football decisions, coaching hires, draft failures, locker room chemistry. And yet, beneath those stories, money was often the quiet accelerant. How does power rot when everyone believes it is secure? When does confidence become denial? Who benefits when silence is mistaken for strength? They ask players, fans, media, and even leagues themselves to buy into an idea of permanence. To trust that the people in charge know not only how to win, but how to sustain winning responsibly. When that belief system fractures, the collapse is not just competitive. It is cultural. During its peak, this dynasty symbolized control. It suggested that success had been mastered. That risk was calculated. That growth was intentional. But the truth is that no dynasty escapes gravity forever. The only question is whether it prepares for descent or pretends it will never fall. In this case, preparation was replaced by assumption. The assumption that revenue would continue to rise. That debt could be managed later. That future success would justify present excess. Those assumptions felt reasonable in the moment. They always do, but they also delayed the reckoning. I am drawn to this story because it exposes a lie we tell ourselves about greatness. That excellence protects against collapse. That winning ensures wisdom. That dominant organizations cannot quietly fail. But history teaches us the opposite. The higher something rises, the more painful its confrontation with reality becomes. Financial instability does not announce itself on Sunday afternoons. It reveals itself in private meetings, in revised forecasts, in borrowed time. It reveals itself slowly enough that people can convince themselves it is temporary, that one more winning season will buy more time. That silence is safer than alarm. For players, the danger was invisible. They competed within a structure they trusted. They tied their careers to a belief system that promised stability. For fans, the dynasties still felt intact. And for those in power, success provided comfort. Comfort that became complacency. This is not a story about greed in the simplistic sense. It is a story about momentum. About how success creates pressure to maintain image, expand influence, and exceed expectations. But those moments were absorbed by confidence, because the team kept winning. And winning became the argument against restraint. When collapse finally approaches, it does not feel dramatic. It feels inconvenient, like something to manage quietly, like a problem best solved internally. And that instinct to contain rather than confront is what nearly turned instability into extinction. This dynasty came closer to financial ruin than most people will ever know. Metaphorically, not rhetorically, practically, structurally, and the margin between survival and collapse was thinner than the narratives ever suggested. That near miss is what makes this story essential, because it forces us to rethink how dynasties actually function, and how fragile even the strongest institutions can become when money is treated as invisible. Championships did not prevent instability here. They delayed its exposure. Success did not fix the problem. It postponed accountability. And by the time reality caught up, the consequences were nearly irreversible. When you strip away the mythology, what remains is a lesson about systems, about how belief can overpower oversight, about how silence can feel safer than truth, and about how legacy can be undone not by failure, but by avoidance. As I move through this story, I return to that silence. The one that comes after dominance fades, the one that reveals what success was hiding. That silence is not empty, it is full of answers. And once you hear them, you cannot pretend they were not always there. To understand how a dynasty nearly collapsed, you first have to understand what a dynasty actually is. Not the simplified version that lives in highlight reels or championship counts, but the deeper structure that allows dominance to last. In the NFL, a dynasty is not just about winning titles. Titles are outcomes. Dynasties are systems. A true dynasty rests on stability, not just coaching stability, but ownership stability. Decision-making that survives short-term emotion. Financial structures that allow success to be sustained without desperation. Revenue control that creates insulation from downturns. And talent retention that ensures the core of the organization does not erode the moment adversity arrives. When those elements are aligned, championships follow. When they are not, championships can still arrive, but they arrive on borrowed time. This episode centers on one of the most dominant franchises in modern NFL history. A team that won so consistently, it reshaped expectations. It dictated how football should be played, how organizations should be run, and how success should look. For years, it felt inevitable, predictable, almost mechanical. At its peak, this dynasty was everywhere. Television coverage framed it as the gold standard. Commentators spoke about culture more than tactics. Players from other teams openly admired its structure. Journalists wrote about inevitability. The public narrative was clear. This organization had figured it out. But beneath that narrative lived a contradiction that only becomes visible in hindsight. The very years that produced dominance also produced decisions that destabilized the future. Financial commitments layered on top of one another. Costs deferred in the name of momentum. Risks accumulated quietly because success made urgency feel unnecessary. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the era in which the dynasty rose. At the time, the NFL was expanding economically at a historic pace. Television contracts grew larger. Sponsorship money increased. Franchise valuations climbed annually. The league sold certainty. Owners were told growth was inevitable. That football was recession-proof. That revenues would always rise faster than expenses. Salary rules reinforced this belief. The cap created the illusion of order, but creative accounting allowed obligations to be pushed forward. Bonuses could be deferred. Money could be structured in ways that made the present look clean while the future grew crowded. As long as revenue projections held, the system appeared stable. Ownership power structures further insulated these decisions. Teams were private entities within a public league. Financials were not transparent. Losses could be hidden. Risks could be contained. And as long as a team was winning, scrutiny was minimal. This dynasty benefited from all of it. Championships gave leverage. Success created influence. Influence reduced oversight. And over time, the organization began to operate under the assumption that its status made it different, that its margin for error was wider, that its success justified exceptional risk. During its peak years, the dynasty was not just winning, it was defining culture. Players spoke about trust, about professionalism, about unity. A former player once said, "We never worried about tomorrow there because everything felt handled." That confidence was real, and it was earned on the field. But off the field, the math was becoming complicated. Financial decisions made during those years were framed as investments, spending to sustain dominance, paying premiums to protect continuity, expanding commitments based on projected growth. Each move felt defensible, sensible even, especially when paired with winning seasons. Deferred costs became a tool. Push obligations forward. Restructure later. Depend on future revenue to smooth present risk. In isolation, these decisions were common league practice. Together, they formed a pattern. A stacking of risk that depended on uninterrupted success. Journalists who later examined the books described it as quiet acceleration. No reckless plunge. Just steady movement toward an edge no one wanted to acknowledge. One veteran financial reporter said, "There was never a single moment where you could say, 'This is where it broke.' It was more like a pressure valve that never released." Inside the building, loyalty played a role. Organizations built on trust often resist internal skepticism. Questioning leadership can feel like betrayal. Raising financial concerns during winning seasons can feel counterproductive. And so, silence became part of the culture. Non-disclosure agreements reinforced that silence. Financial realities stayed internal. Contracts were protected by confidentiality. Even players rarely understood the structure supporting their own careers. They trusted the brand, and the brand was still winning. Media protection also mattered. Winning teams are covered differently. Scrutiny softens. Stories focus on success rather than sustainability. Access is protected. Relationships are maintained. As long as the product on the field is compelling, deeper questions are often postponed. One executive who later spoke anonymously put it plainly. He said, "When you keep winning, nobody wants to be the person asking if the foundation is cracking." That dynamic allowed the contradiction to grow. A dynasty celebrated for control, slowly losing it. A system admired for stability, quietly depending on projections instead of guarantees. A belief system that assumed greatness could manage consequences indefinitely. This episode matters now because the NFL has changed, but the underlying incentives have not. Teams still chase dominance. Owners still assume growth. Revenue streams are larger, but so are obligations. And the lessons from this near collapse remain unresolved. We will walk through how the money moved, where it was invested, where it disappeared, how warning signs emerged, and why they were ignored. We will examine who benefited from silence and who paid the price for it. And we will confront how close this dynasty came to ending. Not with decline, but with financial failure. This is not revisionist history. The success was real. The dominance was earned. But so were the risks. And understanding both is essential to understanding how fragile even the most powerful organizations can be. What nearly ended this dynasty was not a loss on Sunday. It was a series of decisions made Monday through Saturday. Decisions justified by success, shielded by loyalty, and hidden behind a narrative of invincibility. As we move forward, the goal is not to strip away glory. It is to expose structure. To understand how greatness can quietly undermine itself when belief replaces balance. And why, in the NFL, collapse often begins long before anyone admits it is happening. ownership optimism played a crucial role. During the peak, there was an almost paternal confidence in the organization's strength. Decisions were framed around growth rather than sustainability. Expansion was seen as evidence of health, not risk. Early warning signs did exist. They always do. Subtle shifts in cash flow. Players felt secure. They spoke about stability with conviction. One veteran later recalled that he never worried about the organization's future while he was there. He said everything felt solid, dependable, locked in. That feeling was real. It was built on experience, but it was incomplete. The golden years created emotional security that outpaced financial reality. For players, winning validated everything. Contracts were honored. Facilities were world-class. Leadership felt steady. There was no visible reason to believe anything underneath was unstable. For many, those years were the safest they ever felt in the league. That sense of security mattered because it reinforced silence. When people feel safe, they rarely ask difficult questions. Revenue growth masked structural weaknesses because those weaknesses did not threaten short-term performance. The books did not collapse overnight. Payrolls were met. Operations ran smoothly. There was no crisis forcing transparency. The system functioned well enough to avoid scrutiny. And so risk stacked quietly. Journalists covering the dynasty at the time rarely questioned sustainability. The story was dominance, not durability. Reporting focused on strategy, leadership, culture. Financial analysis remained secondary because there was no visible crisis demanding it. Ownership, executives, players, media, and fans all benefited from this alignment. Everyone enjoyed the rewards of success, and success, in turn, protected the structure supporting it from examination. In hindsight, some inside the organization acknowledged they confused momentum with permanence. One former executive later reflected that winning had made them feel immune to problems that affected other teams. He said they believed their discipline on the field translated automatically to discipline everywhere else. That belief was comforting. It was also flawed. The golden years were not fraudulent. The excellence was real. The legacy earned. But beneath the achievements, the financial foundation was quietly becoming less flexible. The dynasty was not collapsing yet, but it was narrowing its margin for error. That is the cost of success when it is not paired with restraint. The more you win, the harder it becomes to imagine losing. And the harder it becomes to imagine losing, the easier it is to assume tomorrow will always pay for today. Players remember those years fondly, and they should. For many, it was the best football of their lives. But they also remember how sudden the change felt later. how security evaporated faster than expected, how stability revealed itself as conditional. The golden years covered everything, including the truth. They covered imbalance with competence, risk with revenue, warning signs with applause. And by the time winning slowed, the foundation had already been strained. That is how dynasties begin to fall. Not in chaos, not in disgrace, but quietly, while everything still looks perfect. Winning creates a story everyone wants to believe, but money tells a different one. During the golden years, the trophies drew attention away from the flow beneath them. People saw championships and assumed health. They saw packed stadiums and assumed profit. They saw dominance and assumed sustainability. What they did not see was how complicated the financial machinery had become, and how much of it depended on assumptions that had never been tested by adversity. Revenue during this period was significant and growing. Ticket sales remained strong year after year. Premium seating expanded. Corporate partnerships grew deeper. Merchandise followed success. National exposure boosted licensing income. Television revenue continued its steady rise as the league became a global entertainment product. On paper, the organization looked rich and getting richer. That surface narrative mattered because it shaped decision-making. Growth did not just fund operations, it justified ambition. When revenue increases feel predictable, caution begins to feel unnecessary. The dynasty operated in an environment where money seemed less like a constraint and more like a resource that could always be found again. Deferred obligations became the hidden weight. Contracts structured to push costs forward worked as intended while revenue climbed. Inside the organization, some understood the complexity. Some recognized the accumulation of obligations. But raising alarm during dominance was uncomfortable. During these years, risk did not arrive dramatically. It layered itself quietly. Each choice built upon the last. Each commitment narrowed flexibility just a little more. And because nothing broke immediately, each decision reinforced the belief that the system could absorb the next one too. I have come to understand this phase as the most deceptive part of the story. This is where warning signs existed but lacked urgency. Where advisors raised concerns that sounded theoretical. Where numbers hinted at compression rather than crisis. And where winning made oversight feel unnecessary. Financial risk escalated not because leadership became careless, but because success normalized optimism. Growth projections were trusted because they had been right before. They warned that flexibility was being traded for short-term control. But warnings delivered without crisis often sound abstract. Challenging direction during success can be perceived as undermining unity. Internal dissent rarely disappears entirely. It quiets, concerns are discussed privately. Numbers are adjusted. language is softened. Warnings become scenarios rather than objections. And when leadership feels confident, those scenarios are often deferred. Winning discouraged oversight in ways that were subtle but powerful. Oversight thrives on uncertainty. Dominance reduces uncertainty. When outcomes align with expectations, scrutiny loses urgency. Every season that ended without consequence reinforced the belief that concerns were manageable. And with each passing year, the cost of reversing course increased. Risk stacking is dangerous because it rarely feels urgent until it is irreversible. Early corrections feel optional. Later corrections become impossible. Somewhere along the way, choice gives way to obligation. This dynasty crossed that threshold quietly, not with alarm, but with reassurance. There were moments when leadership hesitated, moments when caution surfaced. But hesitation inside momentum feels like friction, and friction feels like failure when success is expected. The silent warnings did not fail because they were wrong. They failed because they lacked leverage. Without visible consequence, caution struggled to compete with belief. And belief, reinforced by winning, carried the day. In professional sports, the idea of a league acting as a corrective force is comforting but largely mythical. The NFL projects an image of governance, oversight, and protection of the competitive landscape. Yet, in reality, power flows through the network of owners far more than it flows from rules or regulations. Ownership in the NFL is a fraternity. Relationships matter. Alliances matter. Teams rarely act in isolation because the cost of isolation is influence. In theory, league rules exist to enforce fairness. In practice, the enforcement of those rules is filtered through discretion, negotiation, and political expediency. Revenue sharing is often cited as a stabilizing force. It is a fundamental pillar of how the NFL markets itself as both competitive and equitable. Advisors to the dynasty privately understood these dynamics. They knew intervention was unlikely. Any appeal to league authority could be reframed as alarmist, a threat to confidence in the competitive system. That knowledge allowed the organization to continue stacking risk, confident that oversight would remain muted unless failure became public and unavoidable. Even among owners, political calculus dominated moral calculus. Exposing financial instability in a league that prizes unity could be interpreted as betrayal. If one owner publicly criticized another, it could provoke retaliation in future negotiations, expansion opportunities, or media arrangements. Departments could flag concerns internally, but their influence was limited by the priority placed on relationships and perception. Leadership had to navigate not only internal challenges, but the subtle pressures of political compliance with the fraternity of owners. It might slow revenue growth, harm public perception, or upset the carefully curated balance of power among owners. What emerges from this dynamic is a paradox. The dynasty was protected, but in a way that made collapse more likely. By avoiding exposure, by prioritizing political harmony over structural correction, the league inadvertently allowed risk to accumulate unchecked. Silence in this context was not simply the absence of action. It was an active choice that shaped the organization's trajectory. It is important to understand the human dimension behind these calculations. Owners are not villains. They are actors in a system that rewards perception as much as performance. Loyalty, caution, and self-interest intersect. Decisions are framed around survival and influence rather than morality. Some debt might have been scrutinized. Some borrowing might have been questioned. In retrospect, these dynamics illustrate why collapse almost always surprises outsiders. Fans, analysts, and even players see only outcomes. They see victories, statistics, and championships. They do not see the political calculus that protects risk. They do not see how silence can be a structural force as powerful as any financial instrument. The unseen mechanisms of governance can either stabilize or amplify fragility. In this case, they did the latter. It was the product of a system that allowed political convenience to outweigh prudence. The machinery of influence, loyalty, and discretion shaped the environment in which risk accumulated quietly. It dictated when warnings would be acknowledged and when they would be deferred. And ultimately, it shaped the organization's capacity to survive the pressures it created for itself. This is why outside intervention never came, why early alarms were ignored, and why the dynasty could continue stacking obligations while projecting invincibility. What appeared as self-assurance was partially an artifact of a system designed to avoid scrutiny. And that protection, while appearing benign, concealed fragility that would later define the stakes for everyone involved. For the players, the field was reality. Everything else, the money, the projections, the debt, the political calculations, was invisible. They stepped onto the turf, expecting consistency, expecting structure, expecting loyalty in return for loyalty. And for years, they received exactly what they expected. Practices were organized. Travel was seamless. Facilities were world-class. Coaching was methodical. But all the while, beneath the surface, the organization was quietly accumulating obligations it would soon struggle to honor. The disconnect between what players experienced and what was happening behind closed doors created a unique tension. On the field, they were champions. In meetings, they were assured stability. They received paychecks, bonuses, and promises. And yet, by the time some of them fully understood the financial instability around them, that security felt provisional rather than permanent. Contracts, once considered guaranteed, became conditional in practice. Deferred bonuses, obligations structured years in advance. And reliance on projected revenue meant that players' long-term earnings were far more fragile than they had believed. The assurances that had anchored their loyalty began to feel less like promises and more like assumptions. One veteran later reflected, "We thought our futures were secure because the team had always delivered. We thought loyalty worked both ways. It didn't." This sense of emotional betrayal weighed as heavily as the financial reality. Players had given everything: bodies, focus, and mental endurance. They had endured the physical toll of the game, confident that the organization's management of finances mirrored the discipline and preparation they brought to the field. When that mirror fractured, the impact was profound. It was a betrayal not only of contracts, but of trust. The locker room itself became a space of contradiction. Energy, camaraderie, and drive persisted. But undercurrents of unease began to form as players learned of restructuring, deferred obligations, and debt accumulation. Veteran leaders had to navigate a difficult balance. Motivating teammates while processing uncertainty about the organization's ability to honor commitments. Younger players relied on that leadership and were often left in a state of confusion, hearing rumors without confirmation. Some players tried to reconcile the dissonance by focusing exclusively on performance. Winning games, securing playoff berths, and maintaining personal statistics became a method of survival. Yet even those who compartmentalized understood that their physical labor was sustaining. A machine increasingly strained by financial misalignment. The same victories that had reinforced optimism now obscured the fragility lurking beneath every contract extension and operational decision. Direct accounts from players illustrate the emotional dimension of this disconnection. One quarterback, reflecting on the years before collapse became public, described a growing sense of fragility he only understood retrospectively. He said, "You trust that the system supporting you is as disciplined as your preparation on the field." I didn't realize how much was being deferred until we started feeling the edges in ways we couldn't ignore. That sentiment echoes across the locker room. Trust in an organization, once implicit, is now conditional when the financial foundation is threatened. Players who had internalized confidence in leadership faced an unfamiliar tension. The sense that effort and discipline on the field might no longer guarantee fairness, security, or professional respect off it. Contracts that seemed standard suddenly required scrutiny. Deferred clauses, long-term incentives, and structured bonuses needed closer attention. Legal teams were consulted more frequently. Players began to ask questions they had previously assumed unnecessary. Every interaction with management became a subtle negotiation of trust rather than a simple confirmation of professional standards. Beyond financial uncertainty, the psychological toll was significant. Athletes are conditioned to operate under pressure, but financial instability introduces an entirely different layer of stress. The anxiety of wondering whether the organization could honor promises, protect careers, or maintain infrastructure is fundamentally different from the anxiety of competition. It is chronic, invisible, and inescapable. The irony is striking. The dynasty's physical dominance continued, even as the financial structure faltered. Players delivered performances that met or exceeded expectations, while the organization's obligations grew more tenuous. They kept the machine running while the gears beneath it strained under misalignment. That tension, invisible to fans and media, created an undercurrent of vulnerability in the organization that would later prove decisive. As the disconnect widened, locker room culture shifted subtly but meaningfully. Veterans became protectors of morale, while privately grappling with disillusionment. Younger players absorbed uncertainty they could neither fully understand nor address. Communication patterns changed. The implicit trust that had previously underpinned unity became conditional, filtered through a lens of skepticism. Players' retrospective accounts reveal how loyalty was tested. One defensive leader admitted that, at the time, he assumed financial complexity was normal for a successful organization. Only when deferred payments and obligations surfaced did he understand the depth of the disconnect. He described the emotional impact as more destabilizing than any loss on the field. Winning could be endured, betrayal could not. That emotional weight influenced performance indirectly. Confidence in the organization is a psychological buffer. When it erodes, players compensate with heightened vigilance, cautious engagement, or overinvestment in proving personal value. Each of these responses has subtle costs: mental fatigue, stress-induced errors, or relational tension. The physical performance remains, but the cognitive and emotional load increases. What emerges from this phase is the human cost of financial instability in professional sports. Players were both shielded and exposed. They had the appearance of security, yet lived inside a system accumulating risk they could not perceive. Their labor sustained a structure that was quietly precarious. Their trust, which had been assumed permanent, became provisional. And when the financial realities became unavoidable, the shock was amplified precisely because it contradicted their lived experience on the field. This phase also emphasizes the fragility of dynastic perception. A team may appear unstoppable because of victories, statistics, and accolades, but the lived experience of players reveals that invisible fractures can exist alongside physical dominance. A dynasty in its golden years is as much a social construct as a performance construct. Trust, perception, and morale are as integral to its endurance as any strategic innovation or tactical brilliance. By the time the instability was fully recognized, the emotional and professional dissonance was entrenched. Players had invested physically, mentally, and emotionally in a system they had assumed was secure. The revelation of risk introduced not only financial anxiety, but a profound sense of betrayal that shaped relationships, performance, and the organization's internal culture for years. The lesson of this phase is stark. Dynasties are not only structural and financial systems, but are social contracts between leadership and the athletes whose labor sustains them. When that contract is silently violated by accumulated risk, trust fractures. The field may still produce victories, but loyalty, cohesion, and morale are harder to maintain. For the players caught in the middle, the dynasty's near collapse was experienced not in headlines, but in quiet uncertainty. It was a personal confrontation with fragility that no scoreboard could reveal. And that confrontation would shape the trajectory of the organization as dramatically as any on-field defeat could. The moment everything almost collapsed did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or an instant crash. It came quietly, like a slow tilt of the earth that is imperceptible until the tipping point is reached. It arrived in spreadsheets, in credit reports, in internal memos, in subtle pressure from bankers who had extended the organization every benefit of doubt for years. And it arrived in the faintest rumble of league attention that suggested something was no longer invisible. By this stage, obligations had accumulated to the point where routine financial maneuvers could no longer mask fragility. Deferred payments, leveraged borrowing, and layered contracts had created a lattice of dependencies that was difficult to untangle without causing disruption. The organization had long assumed momentum would continue to cover gaps. By now, momentum had slowed, leaving exposure in stark relief. Credit pressure became a critical factor. Lenders who had once extended loans with confidence began to signal caution. Lines of credit that had seemed reliable were reviewed, interest rates questioned, and terms subtly tightened. The organization was forced to reassess what it could fund without appearing weak. Every borrowing decision now carried the risk of public perception, and perception mattered as much as balance sheets. Simultaneously, the league began to show signs of scrutiny, though still filtered through political calculation. Conversations behind closed doors hinted at concern over the franchise's ability to meet long-term obligations. League executives were cautious, aware of the political and reputational cost of intervening, but equally aware that the appearance of unchecked risk could not continue indefinitely. Subtle inquiries arrived not as intervention, but as signals. Reminders that even untouchable franchises are accountable in the broader ecosystem. The specter of forced action, including potential sale, surfaced quietly but decisively. Ownership, which had once assumed continuity as a right, is confronted with the possibility that control could be challenged if the organization failed to demonstrate solvency. The mere discussion of a sale, even hypothetically, sent shockwaves internally. It reframed risk from abstract numbers into existential stakes. Within the franchise, internal communications reflected tension for the first time that could no longer be ignored. Departments that had once operated with autonomy were now closely coordinated. decisions were measured not only for operational impact, but also for financial signaling. Every move was considered through the lens of exposure and credibility. Even small errors could compound risk, and the psychological weight of that understanding was palpable across the leadership structure. For players, this season felt ordinary at first. Wins, losses, practice routines, and game day rituals continued as before. But off the field, subtle changes began to ripple through the organization. Contract negotiations were more precise. Internal meetings carried a quieter tension. And executives displayed caution in communications. Veterans picked up on shifts in mood. They sensed that something was different, though the scale remained invisible. The media, accustomed to seeing the dynasty as an unassailable model, began to note small anomalies. Reports hinted at cautious optimism, mixed with financial prudence, but the language was measured. No public alarm sounded, and the franchise's dominant record on the field continued to overshadow any whispers. Success still masked instability, but the margin for error had narrowed dramatically. This was the season where collapse nearly became public. The combination of internal pressure, lender caution, and league signals created a window in which a misstep could have triggered a crisis visible to the outside world. A delayed loan, a missed payment, or a sudden revelation of deferred obligations could have produced headlines, shaken confidence, and threatened the franchise's ability to maintain control. Executives knew the stakes. Meetings that had previously been routine became strategic rehearsals. Every potential consequence was modeled. Contingency plans were drafted for scenarios that had once been considered improbable. And yet, the organization continued to function, carefully balancing optimism with realism, hope with pragmatism. What is remarkable about this period is how close the dynasty came to public exposure without it actually occurring. Success continued to serve as a buffer, but not indefinitely. The tension between perception and reality was at its peak. Everyone inside the franchise understood that stability was now contingent, fragile, and dependent on both execution and discretion. Players remained largely shielded, though some veterans perceived the subtle shifts. Contract talks became more deliberate. Negotiations reflected caution previously absent. Bonuses and guarantees were discussed in more detailed terms. The safety they had felt during the golden years was being replaced with awareness, though still mediated by trust in leadership. Creditors and advisors understood the significance of this season as well. Their communications conveyed patience, but not forgiveness. The organization could navigate these challenges only through careful management and continued operational success. Any misalignment could have accelerated a crisis that had been quietly avoided for years. The psychological weight of this near collapse was immense. Leadership had to balance the public image of invincibility with the private reality of constraint. Risk assessment became constant. Each decision carried implications for solvency, perception, and morale. Stress was high, and the margin for error negligible. Yet, the dynasty held. Through careful maneuvering, internal alignment, and a measure of fortune, the organization navigated the tipping point without allowing collapse to become visible. This season demonstrated both the fragility of perception and the effectiveness of disciplined management, but it also illustrated how near the edge the franchise had come. In retrospect, this season stands as the clearest example of how accumulated financial decisions, political constraints, and operational dependencies could have combined to destroy a dynasty. It was a moment defined not by chaos, but by balance on a knife's edge. Momentum, leadership, and cautious decision-making kept the organization from plummeting, but only barely. For those inside, the memory of that season is visceral. Meetings, conversations, and strategies remain imprinted as moments of acute tension. Leadership recognized the stakes and responded with precision. Yet the awareness that one misstep could have exposed fragility to the public shaped every action going forward. This near collapse also underscores a central truth. Dynasties do not fail in a single season. They fail because the cumulative weight of decisions, obligations, and expectations eventually intersects with limits. The near-collapse season was the point at which those limits nearly became reality, reminding everyone that no level of dominance is immune to the pressures of complex systems. It is a lesson in precarious balance, in the illusion of safety, and in the quiet forces that shape organizational survival. Success masked fragility, but the tipping point exposed how thin the line truly was between perception and catastrophe. After the near collapse, the organization entered a phase defined less by resolution than by preservation. The priority shifted from correcting structural vulnerability to managing perception. Momentum had shielded them for years, but once the fragility of the financial foundation became apparent to leadership, the focus turned to narratives, messaging, and the careful orchestration of belief. The dynasty needed to appear untouchable, even while internal structures strained under accumulated obligations. Public relations became a central tool. Every announcement, press conference, and interview was carefully crafted to reinforce confidence. Success was framed as continuity, resilience, and strategic brilliance. Achievements on the field were highlighted while financial complexities remained unspoken. The dynasty's image was a currency as valuable as any revenue stream. Preserving it was now considered essential for maintaining operational stability. Strategic leaks played a subtle but significant role. By selectively releasing information that suggested financial stability, leadership could guide public perception without making concrete promises. Small indicators of confidence, carefully timed quotes from executives, and controlled messaging served to reassure investors, sponsors, and fans. It was a delicate balancing act. Too little information might provoke speculation. Too much could reveal the depth of the risk. False assurances became routine. Internal communications often echoed the external messaging. Employees, staff, and players were given statements that reinforced stability, even when internal projections suggested otherwise. Assumptions of solvency were emphasized. Risk was downplayed. Optimism was presented as fact. This approach allowed daily operations to continue without widespread panic, but it also delayed the confrontation with reality. Media cooperation, whether tacit or explicit, reinforced these efforts. Journalists and analysts, accustomed to relying on access and official statements, perpetuated the perception of strength. Investigative scrutiny remained limited because the organization projected confidence, maintained access, and controlled information. As long as appearances were managed carefully, the truth lagged behind reality. Inside the organization, this approach required constant coordination. Leadership needed to ensure messaging aligned with financial realities, enough to avoid contradiction, but optimistic enough to maintain trust. Departments communicated in coded terms, emphasizing control while acknowledging fragility only when necessary. Every public-facing statement was weighed for its potential impact on perception, market confidence, and internal morale. The psychological dimension was profound. Leaders faced the paradox of knowing instability existed while projecting certainty. Decision-making now involved not only operational and financial considerations, but also the manipulation of belief. The act of denial became a strategic tool. It was not wishful thinking. It was active management of a narrative essential for survival. For players, this phase reinforced disconnect. Daily routines continued, victories accumulated, and the dynasty's dominance persisted. Meanwhile, internal conversations revealed layers of risk they had previously been insulated from. Some veterans sensed the careful orchestration of confidence. They recognized that leadership was managing optics as much as operations. Yet the full scale of financial fragility remained obscured. Internally, denial manifested in subtle ways. Departments treated warnings as hypothetical rather than actionable. Financial constraints were addressed selectively, prioritizing areas that would maintain the appearance of solvency. Deferred obligations continued to accumulate, though carefully staggered. The system had to operate under pressure while maintaining the illusion of stability. External stakeholders experienced only the carefully curated version of reality. Investors, sponsors, and partners were reassured through controlled communication. Creditors were engaged selectively, guided by confidence and minimal disclosure. Public narrative and private reality existed in parallel, one stable and inspiring, the other fragile and conditional. The consequences of this lag between truth and perception were significant. By prioritizing appearances over solving underlying problems, the organization gained breathing room, but also allowed risk to grow. Short-term stability was achieved, but structural vulnerability remained. The dynasty continued to function, yet each victory carried the unspoken weight of deferred consequences. This phase also highlights a recurring pattern in elite organizations. Success breeds confidence, and confidence often fosters denial. When leadership perceives exposure as a threat, there is a tendency to manage perception rather than confront underlying fragility. In this case, denial was both protective and dangerous. It prevented panic while delaying corrective action. The orchestration of messaging became an art form. Leadership crafted statements emphasizing continuity while selectively highlighting initiatives that projected competence. Interviews with executives stressed strategic foresight, resilience, and dominance. Internal memos reiterated optimism, instructing staff to reinforce confidence in their interactions. Every gesture, statement, and initiative contributed to the perception of strength, while the underlying structural tension remained unresolved. Even as the organization executed damage control, internal awareness of vulnerability increased. Leaders understood that this was a temporary reprieve. They knew that appearances could only sustain stability so long as external conditions remained favorable and internal obligations did not exceed capacity. Every action was calculated to delay confrontation with reality while maintaining operational continuity. For players and staff, this duality created an invisible pressure. Victory and routine suggested normalcy, while the underlying financial and organizational dynamics introduced uncertainty that was impossible to ignore completely. The dynasty's identity remained intact publicly, but internally, careful observers sensed that the stability they relied upon was conditional and increasingly fragile. By the end of this phase, it was clear that managing perception could buy time, but it could not eliminate the underlying risk. The organization had successfully prevented public awareness, yet the structural vulnerabilities persisted. Each deferred obligation, each financial assumption, and each strategic denial increased the eventual cost of confronting reality. Survival carries a price, and for this dynasty, that price was measured in ways that could not always be quantified in dollars or contracts. Every strategic decision made to maintain the organization's facade of stability came at a cost to long-term competitiveness, organizational culture, and trust. It is easy to look back at the seasons when victories continued and imagine that continuity meant resilience, but the truth is far more complicated. Survival demanded sacrifice, and those sacrifices left scars that would shape the franchise for years. One of the most immediate costs was talent. Players who could command higher compensation elsewhere, or who sought stability and clarity in their contracts, were lost. The organization's attempts to navigate financial fragility meant offering less than market value in some cases, deferring guarantees, or restructuring contracts in ways that introduced uncertainty. Young stars chose opportunities where long-term security was tangible, rather than contingent on carefully managed perception. Each departure removed not only skill, but also institutional knowledge, leadership, and morale. The Dynasty maintained its on-field competitiveness, but the margin for error narrowed every time a cornerstone player left. The loss of talent was compounded by the erosion of trust. Players, staff, and even some executives began to understand that the organization's public optimism masked deeper vulnerabilities. Promises were made, then renegotiated or deferred. Assurances were presented as commitments, but conditional in practice. This subtle betrayal reshaped relationships inside the team. Veterans questioned whether loyalty would be reciprocated. Younger players observed patterns of compromise between principle and survival. The internal social contract, once implicit and robust, became contingent, fragile, and constantly renegotiated. Culture shifted as a result. Where once confidence, cohesion, and continuity had defined the locker room and executive suite, now pragmatism and caution became dominant. Decisions were increasingly evaluated not solely on merit or long-term value, but on their ability to preserve operational stability in the face of financial constraints. Innovation was curtailed. Risk-taking in pursuit of competitive advantage was measured against survival imperatives. The team could still win, but it did so with one eye on the scoreboard and the other on a ledger of obligations it could barely manage. This survival mindset produced subtle but consequential psychological effects. Players and staff were forced to internalize an invisible tension, continue performing as if stability were absolute while knowing, at some level, that it was conditional. That duality shaped behavior, motivation, and decision-making. Some compensated with overinvestment in personal performance, while others adopted cautious disengagement from aspects of team strategy or organizational politics. The human cost of this balancing act was invisible to fans, but palpable inside the organization. Long-term competitiveness also suffered in ways less visible than individual departures. Resource allocation became focused on immediate survival rather than strategic growth. Investments in development, scouting, infrastructure, or innovation were deferred or minimized. The Dynasty's ability to sustain dominance over multiple seasons relied on short-term adaptation rather than systemic planning. In effect, the organization traded durability for continuity. It remained upright, but it was no longer operating with the same margin for excellence it had enjoyed during its golden years. Even leadership experienced strain. Executives had to navigate the dual pressures of maintaining public confidence and managing internal instability. Every decision required weighing immediate operational success against potential exposure of structural weakness. The cumulative stress reshaped internal dynamics, producing cautious conservatism in some areas, micromanagement in others, and periodic friction between long-term ambition and short-term necessity. The identity of the dynasty itself was altered. What had once been defined by dominance, innovation, and cohesion became defined increasingly by survival. Victories continued, but they were no longer solely expressions of competitive superiority. They were, in part, the product of careful management of perception, tactical retention of talent, and orchestration of belief. The team's on-field identity remained intact, but the underlying organizational identity had shifted. Loss of trust, cultural adjustment, and resource constraints produced ripple effects. Mentorship networks within the team were disrupted as veteran departures reduced institutional memory. Player development pipelines slowed. Leadership succession plans were complicated by uncertainty. Even when wins were achieved, The organization was operating under a shadow of fragility that would later amplify the impact of any further disruption. The cost of survival also extended beyond the immediate organization. Fans, sponsors, and partners experienced continuity, but at the expense of transparency. The perception of invincibility was preserved, but the reality of vulnerability was hidden. Those who had invested emotionally or financially in the dynasty were unknowingly complicit in a system prioritizing survival over principle. The organization's public identity remained untarnished, but it came at the expense of long-term trust and resilience. Internal narratives reflected a growing pragmatism. Meetings and strategy sessions increasingly centered on operational triage rather than expansion or growth. Contingency planning became routine. Leadership became adept at stretching resources, navigating political dynamics, and managing perception. These skills preserved the organization, but also conditioned the team to operate under constant constraint. Creativity, spontaneity, and strategic ambition were tempered by the need to avoid exposing weaknesses. This phase also highlighted the subtle tension between survival and identity. The dynasty could endure, but endurance was no longer synonymous with excellence. Victories continued to be celebrated, but the knowledge that each success relied on carefully managed circumstances created a persistent undercurrent of caution. Identity, once derived from dominance and culture, became intertwined with risk management and the management of perception. Players who remained internalized this tension. Their performances were real, but their experience of the organization had shifted. Leadership was respected, but its authority was now filtered through the lens of survival. Confidence in the long-term direction was cautious. The dynasty's spirit persisted, but it carried a hidden weight: the cost of navigating fragility while preserving outward strength. Looking back, the cost of survival is clear. It was a sacrifice of talent, trust, culture, long-term competitiveness, and identity. Each layer of compromise, each deferred decision, and each strategic denial allowed the organization to continue functioning. But the very strategies that preserved continuity also set the stage for future vulnerability. Survival bought time, but time alone could not restore the dynasty to its former, unassailable state. Ultimately, this phase demonstrates the complexity of sustaining elite organizations under financial strain. Survival is not free. It requires difficult choices, compromises that may be invisible to outsiders, and a constant negotiation between perception and reality. For this dynasty, those costs reshaped the internal landscape, altered career trajectories, and redefined the meaning of dominance itself. Financial normalization was a second factor shaping the post-crisis era. Obligations were restructured, debts addressed, and deferred liabilities managed with greater scrutiny. This brought stability, but stability carried its own consequences. Revenue growth slowed under tighter control. Spending decisions, once bold and opportunistic, became cautious and measured. Investments in infrastructure, player development, and innovation were no longer prioritized with the same freedom. The organization survived, yet the ability to leverage financial advantage for sustained excellence was compromised. Survival imposed a structural conservatism that reshaped decision-making at every level. Legacy revision began quietly. Historians, journalists, and fans continued to celebrate championships and historic feats. But the narrative shifted to include the fragility that had been carefully hidden during the dynasty's peak. The story of dominance became interwoven with tales of risk, near collapse, and strategic endurance rather than sheer invincibility. Players who had been symbols of unassailable success were now framed within a more complex human and organizational context. The mythology of perfection was replaced with a nuanced account of brilliance, constrained by circumstance and choice. This process of reevaluation altered how history remembered the dynasty. The golden years remained impressive, but the post-crisis seasons tempered narratives of dominance. Where once the franchise had been seen as a model of unbroken excellence, it became an illustration of the delicate balance between achievement and structural integrity. Scholars and analysts highlighted the lessons. Success can obscure vulnerability, and the perception of invincibility may mask fragility that endures long after it is finally acknowledged. Players experienced the consequences firsthand. Veteran leaders who had navigated near collapse carried the weight of both memory and responsibility. Younger athletes entered a culture shaped by pragmatism rather than idealized excellence. Expectations adjusted. Motivation persisted, yet it was informed by an acute awareness that dominance is conditional, fragile, and negotiable. Performance was influenced by the cognitive load of understanding organizational fragility alongside the physical demands of the game. Even leadership adapted to the new reality. The organization could no longer assume that victories alone would reinforce confidence. Management's role shifted from strategic dominance to careful stewardship. Operational decisions were measured for risk mitigation, credibility, and sustainability rather than pure competitive advantage. This prudence ensured stability, but it also limited the capacity for bold innovation that had defined the dynasty's earlier years. Success was possible, but the expression of dominance was constrained. Financial practices, while stabilized, remained conservative. Long-term contracts, deferred incentives, and complex borrowing were replaced by transparent, measured obligations. Revenue allocation prioritized risk management over opportunistic expansion. Infrastructure investments were deliberate rather than expansive. The organization could function without crisis, but the capacity to exploit opportunities or assert competitive supremacy with the confidence of past decades was diminished. Survival had been achieved at the cost of the full breadth of dominance. Fans and public perception also evolved. Those who had witnessed the golden years continued to celebrate historic feats. Yet there was recognition that the dynasty's later years lacked the unbroken momentum of its peak. Social narratives emphasized resilience rather than inevitability. Victory remained meaningful, but it was now framed within a context of careful calculation and long-term sustainability rather than pure, audacious brilliance. Enthusiasm persisted, tempered by an awareness that the organization's success was no longer as absolute. The psychological dimension within the organization reinforced this reality. Players and staff internalized a dual lesson. Past mistakes could not be ignored, and structural vigilance was now a permanent feature. The legacy of near collapse became both a cautionary tale and a guide for navigating future challenges. This awareness shaped decision-making, interactions, and internal culture, producing a climate where prudence coexisted with ambition but constrained the fearless experimentation of earlier years. Despite these limitations, the dynasty retained significant achievement. Championships were counted, records maintained, and milestones celebrated. Yet the distinction between survival and victory was now clear. Survival ensured continuity and stability, but it did not restore the effortless dominance that had characterized the team's peak. Victories were no longer a product of structural confidence alone, but of disciplined adaptation, careful management, and resilience in the face of lingering fragility. The legacy of this dynasty offers a broader lesson in professional sports and organizational life. Dominance is multidimensional. It depends not only on talent, strategy, and performance, but also on financial stability, political context, and the alignment of perception and reality. Neglecting any of these dimensions, even temporarily, can produce lasting consequences that survival alone cannot erase. The franchise's trajectory demonstrates that the gap between excellence and sustainability is narrow and unforgiving. History remembers the dynasty with complexity. Spectators admire the victories, analysts dissect strategies, and players are celebrated for skill and endurance. Yet, embedded within that legacy is the story of near collapse, the consequences of strategic denial, and the hidden fragility that shaped every decision. Survival preserved the franchise, but it reframed the narrative. Dominance is not immutable, and even the most celebrated organizations are vulnerable to the quiet accumulation of risk. The dynasty that survived but never fully recovered illustrates that endurance is distinct from triumph. Performance, perception, and financial management must align continuously to sustain excellence. When alignment falters, survival may still be achieved, but the expression of dominance, the cohesion of culture, and the certainty of identity are permanently altered. The story of this franchise serves as both a caution and a reflection. Victory is transient, fragility is persistent, and history remembers both in equal measure. The story of a single dynasty's near collapse is not only a tale of one organization's miscalculations. It is also a mirror reflecting systemic patterns embedded in the league itself. The NFL operates on a delicate architecture of incentives, protections, and cultural norms that make it both resilient and remarkably opaque. While individual franchises may appear autonomous, their financial choices, governance, and operational latitude are shaped by league-wide structures. The lessons from one dynasty's struggle illustrate broader truths about how risk is accumulated, hidden, and managed or ignored across the entire sport. One of the clearest parallels emerges in how revenue is distributed and monitored. The NFL's system of revenue sharing, salary caps, and collective bargaining is designed to create parity and prevent catastrophic failure. Yet, these mechanisms also have blind spots. Teams can borrow aggressively, defer obligations, and manipulate projections to maintain the appearance of compliance while stretching structural limits. A franchise in crisis can continue to function and compete, and in some cases, even thrive, as long as momentum masks vulnerability. The system prioritizes operational continuity over proactive intervention, leaving the league itself reliant on perception as much as oversight. Structural incentives play a significant role in this dynamic. Ownership receives disproportionate rewards for apparent success, championships, media acclaim, and financial growth. Conversely, accountability is often deferred until failure becomes undeniable. Advisors, auditors, and league officials may identify risk, but political considerations protecting reputations, maintaining competitive balance, and preserving market confidence frequently temper decisive action. In essence, the league is structured to tolerate and even encourage risk, as long as it does not immediately disrupt the ecosystem. The incentive architecture simultaneously fosters achievement and obscures fragility. This creates environments in which short-term victories can mask long-term instability. Strategic denial, selective disclosure, and perception management are not anomalies. They are embedded behaviors shaped by structural realities. The very factors that allow dynasties to emerge also make them vulnerable to invisible accumulation of risk. Why could this happen again? The league's historical response demonstrates that intervention is reactive rather than preventive. Patterns that produce near collapse can be repeated as long as success continues to obscure warning signs. Structural safeguards, while robust in principle, depend on transparency, consistency, and accurate reporting. When those conditions are unmet intentionally or otherwise, the system permits fragility to accumulate silently. Momentum and perception remain the most powerful shields, delaying exposure and sometimes producing the illusion of invincibility even in precarious circumstances. The system protects certain actors more than others. Ownership enjoys latitude, discretion, and control over information. Players, staff, and even media stakeholders often operate within a filtered reality, absorbing outcomes and consequences, but rarely influencing the structural decision-making that shapes them. League governance, while theoretically overseeing risk, often functions in partnership with franchises to preserve overall stability and competitive balance, sometimes at the expense of fully confronting individual organizational fragility. The protection of reputation and market confidence can outweigh proactive enforcement. Fans, the ultimate observers, rarely see the undercurrents shaping a dynasty's stability. What is visible are victories, records, star athletes, and championship celebrations. What is invisible are deferred liabilities, political compromises, and subtle fiscal maneuvering that ensures survival without addressing root vulnerability. Fans interpret continuity as dominance, assuming that the visible success of a franchise reflects structural integrity. Yet the reality is that perception, not stability, is often the dominant factor in maintaining public confidence. The lessons for the league are double-edged. On one hand, the structure allows teams to endure crisis and maintain operational continuity, preserving competition and market value. On the other hand, the same structure permits risk to grow in the shadows, leaving franchises exposed to near-collapse scenarios that could have been mitigated with proactive transparency and oversight. Internally, executives and decision-makers across the league take note. Observers see how a combination of deferred obligations, selective disclosure, and political calculation can keep a franchise functioning while vulnerability grows. Best practices emerge informally as teams learn to manage perception, maintain morale, and navigate financial complexity without triggering scrutiny. Yet these lessons are often localized. The league's broader structural incentives remain unchanged. The cultural dimension is equally significant. Professional football, with its history of glorifying dominance and perseverance, reinforces the perception that success is inevitable, even under strain. Owners and executives internalize this culture, assuming that operational momentum can substitute for structural foresight. This reinforces short-term thinking, strategic denial, and careful orchestration of appearances. Momentum continues to shield instability, and the cycle repeats until the system is confronted with undeniable exposure. The Dynasty story, when contextualized within league-wide patterns, highlights the fragility of perception as a governing force. Competitive success allows risk to be deferred, narrative to be controlled, and exposure to be minimized. The league itself, as an institution, has an interest in continuity, and that interest shapes the response to instability. Intervention occurs reluctantly, selectively, and often too late to prevent systemic consequences. Ultimately, what the NFL learned and ignored, that structural resilience is not guaranteed by victory alone. Parity systems, revenue sharing, and salary caps provide frameworks, but they cannot substitute for transparency, disciplined oversight, and alignment of incentives. Dynasties will emerge, dominance will appear absolute, and the mechanisms that support both success and survival will continue to operate in the shadows. The same invisible forces that nearly ended one dynasty exist in every franchise, waiting for conditions to converge in ways that can test even the most disciplined organization. Fans may never fully perceive these dynamics, and many players will remain shielded from them. Dynasties, by their very nature, are fragile. They are constructed not only through talent, strategy, and leadership, but also through the careful orchestration of perception, the alignment of incentives, and the management of risk. For fans, the spectacle is one of dominance and invincibility, a narrative of brilliance etched in championships, records, and unforgettable moments. But beneath the surface, the forces that sustain such dominance are often invisible, delicate, and easily destabilized. The dynasty we have examined illustrates that success can mask instability, that momentum can conceal vulnerability, and that victory does not guarantee permanence. Revenue streams, obligations, deferred liabilities, and strategic borrowing shaped the team's fate in ways that were largely invisible to the public and, at times, to players themselves. Financial management or mismanagement became the silent arbiter of survival. And the drama of games dictated the trajectory of careers, the continuity of culture, and the preservation of competitive advantage. Money was the unseen opponent, patient, impartial, and unrelenting, capable of undermining dominance even as victories continued to accumulate. Yet survival was a redefinition of what it meant to be dominant. Players remained professional, but their understanding of organizational fragility altered the psychological landscape of the locker room. Survival allowed continuity, but imposed limitations, teaching that endurance is distinct from unassailable supremacy. The cost of this survival extended beyond balance sheets. Players bore the weight of uncertainty, of promises that were contingent rather than absolute. staff and executives carried responsibility under pressure, forced to operate with one eye on operations and the other on perception. Even fans, who witness only the triumphs and statistics, paid a price. Their understanding of excellence was filtered through a carefully constructed narrative that obscured reality. The collective cost of maintaining the facade of dominance was high, touching every layer of the organization and its extended community. To insiders, however, the rhythm of success is often punctuated by financial juggling, political negotiation, and strategic denial. Glory conceals fragility. Records obscure risk. Championships mask obligations. The very symbols of triumph, the trophies, the celebrations. The cultural mythology can camouflage the slow accumulation of structural vulnerability that ultimately defines the long-term trajectory of an organization. Dominance is therefore both a reward and a concealment. It is proof of excellence and simultaneously a shield that allows unseen forces to operate unchallenged. But this silence is double-edged. While it provides breathing room and sustains perception, it also permits risk to compound. Warning signs go unaddressed, advice goes unheeded, and vulnerabilities accumulate until they are undeniable. The league structures, designed to protect continuity and competitive balance, rely heavily on the credibility of this silence. When managed skillfully, it maintains order. When mismanaged, it amplifies fragility. Silence is both a strategic asset and a latent threat. Reflection on this dynasty's journey reveals a complex interplay between success, risk, and perception. Victories and records are never sufficient alone to define permanence. Momentum can delay exposure, but cannot eliminate it. Financial miscalculations, political compromises, and cultural shifts are capable of undermining even the most celebrated organizations. Legacy is determined not only by what is won on the field, but also by what is managed behind the scenes. The dynasty survived, but the cost of that survival reshaped the organization, altered careers, and reframed historical narratives. In the end, accountability is dispersed. Ownership, executives, and league structures share responsibility for both the near collapse and the preservation that followed. Players, while largely shielded from decision-making, were not immune from the consequences. Fans, relying on perception and reporting, remain observers to forces they cannot control. The story demonstrates how interconnected stakeholders are in the maintenance and unraveling of dynastic power. No single actor dictates outcomes entirely. Instead, collapse is the product of systemic vulnerability, compounded by human behavior, cultural norms, and institutional incentives. The dynasty we have chronicled serves as a lesson for every corner of professional football. It illustrates that excellence must be grounded in sustainable practice, that momentum cannot replace structural integrity, and that perception, while powerful, is always fragile. It teaches that money, often invisible to those focused solely on performance, is a decisive force in determining the fate of organizations. Ultimately, the story invites a sobering reflection. We celebrate champions, remember iconic victories, and immortalize athletes. Yet the invisible foundations supporting these achievements are just as consequential. The forces behind success, financial, structural, cultural, operate silently, often unnoticed, until they intersect with circumstance in ways that reveal vulnerability. This dynasty endured because it navigated complexity, leveraged perception, and managed fragility with skill and precision. Yet endurance required sacrifice. Talent lost, trust eroded, culture reshaped, and identity redefined. The dynasty survived, but it was no longer the unassailable entity it had once been. Its story is a cautionary tale, a reflection on the invisible forces that govern professional sports, and a meditation on the quiet but absolute power of money and perception. As we consider the arc of this franchise, the broader implications are clear. Dynasties are not immortal. Success is contingent. Silence and perception can protect for a time, but they are temporary shields. In the balance between survival and dominance, we see both the resilience and fragility of professional football at its most extreme. The final reflection is that history, fans, and participants alike must recognize the duality of dominance. And that the legacies of both players and organizations are determined as much by what is hidden as by what is celebrated. For players, executives, and fans, the lessons endure. The story of the dynasty is not merely about wins or losses, but about the fragile systems that allow dominance to exist, and the invisible currents that determine whether it lasts. In the end, we are left with a profound understanding. The silence that pervades professional football is more than absence of noise. It is a living, active agent in the shaping of legacy. Dynasties endure, survive, and sometimes falter, but their fate is always intertwined with forces that rarely make themselves visible. Dominance is never absolute, and the cost of maintaining it is paid by everyone in ways both seen and unseen. The dynasty survived, but the lessons it leaves are far greater than the victories it produced.